Sorry for the delay. It's my pleasure to introduce today Dr. Ries. She's an associate professor in the Department of Biology at Georgetown University. Her research focuses on butterfly ecology, conservation, biodiversity informatics. With over 2 decades of experience, her work spans multiple large-scale data sets, particularly those derived from citizen science initiatives. Dr. Ries holds a PhD in biology from Northern Arizona University and a master's in ecology evolution and behavior from Iowa State University, and a bachelor's in zoology from the University of Maryland, where she also completed postdoctoral research in biodiversity informatics. She has held academic and research positions at the University of Maryland and the National Socio-Environment Synthesis Center, and recently served as a science advisor with the National Science Foundation Division of Biological Structure. Her recent publications include high-impact studies on butterfly decline across the United States, the ecological impact of climate change on regional species, and the development of AI tools to aid in community science and conservation. A central theme in her work is integrating monitoring data across diversity programs which she facilitates through infrastructure to help develop, such as the polar base and her leadership in North America Butterfly Monitoring Network and Monarch United. Dr. Ries also collaborates with conservation agencies such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and the Midwest Climate Science Center, helping to translate scientific findings into actionable strategies for land management and species protection. And it is Washington, D.C., Dr. Ries brings a local perspective to her work on regional biodiversity, particularly in and around the national parks of the capital region. So please welcome Dr. Ries. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to see if the echo's not quite as bad when I'm over here. Is there no difference for you guys? I can't hear it as well. But if I stand here, I'm going to have to then ask you to, unless I can pull the, I'll just stand over here. Advance. Yeah. We'll see. I'm going to move away. Well, the good thing, as I said, is that this is an entomology department. So all my background about why insects are so important. Not necessary. We'll just skip over that. Let's see. I always want to start out because I'm talking about butterfly declines today, and butterfly declines to me are, one of the best groups to look at as an indicator for other insect species because we have so much information. So it's always kind of grim when we start going through all the evidence. I also talk a lot about how important insects are. I'll kind of skip over that. But I try to put a little hope in it. So we'll see how I do. I don't know if it's hope or hopium, as they call it, but I'll take it whatever it is. So the one thing I kind of want to say about the insect apocalypse, because again, I don't need to talk to you guys about it, is that, and you might have noticed this too, is that the public is really aware of this, and not just because of the New York Times articles and the things they're hearing about on, whatever podcasts or media they listen to. It's because they see it with their own eyes. Like, people ask me about it all the time, and some of the oh, hello, it's like I'm in a grand hall. But I'm going to keep talking unless you tell me that it would be a good idea for me to stop. But
no worries. Do you mind if I
do whatever you need to do. So anyway, what I was talking about was that people really notice it and people do care. Like, I often feel like when we talk about these issues in the past within the scope of my research, I mean, people always care about butterflies. Like, I study monarchs, and when people find out that I study monarch butterflies, they're like, "You monarchs, that's so awesome." But now they're like, "Oh, I've heard insects are declining. Is that true?" I see it with my own, I don't see as many as I used to. And now I go out into my garden and there are hardly any, bees buzzing around. So, they ask and they're concerned and they kind of know that it's important, even if they can't articulate why it's important. But I think that's a hopeful thing. Like, people notice it's real to them because they see it. They don't have to rely on scientists, which can be losing trust right now. Like, people don't just trust that kind of academic expertise. So I think that's important. Can you go past so this slide, lots of insects are important. I'm going to the next one. Oh, sorry. No. Yeah, that wasn't you. I was just saying, that's usually where I'm like, no, they're really important. This is why. But you guys know that. So I am going to talk about a paper that I was just part of looking at butterfly trends in the US. And this was a grand exercise of bringing together a lot of the butterfly experts, insect conservation practitioners, just a whole group of people who were, just best positioned to try to pull together all the data and look in this comprehensive way in a very large scale. There's obviously a lot of work that's been done in Europe, in the UK especially. So this is such a tiny little continent. This is a very large area over a very, highly varied different types of habitat. And we also have a growing citizen science presence in the US that was really, motivated. Yay, can they still hear me? Can the people on Zoom hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
You can still hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, at 11:21. What time is it? Oh, it's 11:22. But okay. Hopefully, if they can't hear us, they'll let us know. Okay, thank you so much. Whew. I was like, oh, this is what it's like to hear myself talk all the time. So, what these points represent are the surveys that we use, and the vast majority of surveys, like 99% of the surveys are from, well, I'll say 95% because, these surveys right here are from Archie Hero, and I'll talk about him in a minute. But we, focused on, citizen science really took off in 2000. So we focused on 2000 to 2020 and, put together all these surveys, did an integrated model. So we were really pulling together all the surveys, even if they had different protocols. And this analysis showed that over this 20-year period, there's been a 22% decrease in the total number of butterflies. So on average, that means for every 5 butterflies you saw in 2020, you would see, or sorry, in 2000, you would see 4 butterflies now. And we also, it's a very, very coarse scale study. We also separated it up into regions. And these 7 regions are the US Fish and Wildlife regions. And so if you look at the actual species, one of the first things you want to see is that, there are some differences between the regions. And what these bars are showing is the number of species who are declining in terms of statistical significance, possibly declining, but not statistically significant, possibly increasing, and increasing with, in an analysis that's statistically significant. And the reason we put these trends in here is because it is, first of all, we're looking at over 300 species, and it just is informative because it's hard to, the insect populations bounce up and down a lot. It's hard to look for trends. And so we're just looking for trends of the trends, trying to get a sense, like the broadest, most defensible sense we can get. And you can see in the Southwest is where the greatest declines appear to be. And the Pacific Southwest also has relatively higher declines, but the Southwest really stands out. The Midwest just happens to be the place with the densest citizen science surveys in the country. Northeast is pretty good, but the Midwest is the strongest. And that's really because of one person, Doug Tarrin, who started the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network in 1987. And then he became an evangelist for starting citizen science butterfly monitoring program. And so it spread. It was like a social contagion, right? And first it spread to Ohio and Michigan and Iowa, but then it started spreading to other places. And you can see these sort of denser dots up here. That's where the Colorado Butterfly Monitoring Network, which is mostly, the kind of the area around Boulder and the Front Range. So that's why it's pretty small. But it really gives us a lot of data in the mountain prairie region. Of course, then the data is biased. So there are problems with citizen science surveys, but there was a lot of data that went into this analysis. And so I think it's pretty strong analysis. Wandered away from that. And if you look at all the species together, you just basically see the same story. So I'm gonna whiz through these a little bit just to try to catch up. So these are the species that are possibly decreasing. They're not really surprising. A lot of them have a specialized habitat, and the regal fritillaria is one of my favorites because that was what I studied when I was a master's student. But I'll also point out the Baltimore checker spot, which is one of our study species. I'm not going to be talking about this species or the other species where we do lab work, but we do a lot of experimental work trying to understand how climate change is impacting species. And the Baltimore checker spot is one of our main species. So I had to point that out, give some love. So these are not too surprising, but I think what was really surprising, and this is one of the core reasons that people are so concerned about insect declines, is because it's also common insects that are declining. Common pests even, we've got the cabbage white, but they're also incredibly resilient to disturbance. They do very, very well in urban disturbed habitats. And so the fact that we're seeing these, really broad declines across, common species, rare species, it's sort of like a different picture than we used to think about when we're talking about declines. So now I'm going to go through some of the ones that are doing well, but without going through them. But then again, I have to point out our other study species, the silver spotted skipper, which is really, and you can see the caterpillars. They're completely adorable. So, so this comes from a big study, very, very coarse. And I'm just gonna give a little bit more evidence from other studies that are regional and more granular. So this was a big study using the North American Butterfly Association data, which is a program that I work with a lot. But it also has these transects that were set up by Art Shapiro in 1972. And so they did this study, they saw the same basic thing. Species in the West are declining. It's a more granular study. It has a longer time span. So it's just more evidence. But I do always want to give a shout out to Art Shapiro. He started these transects in 1972, and he has surveyed them every other week during like half the year during the season in California. Since 1972, and he's done until recently where he doesn't do the high altitude ones anymore. He's done this all himself. He doesn't have a car, so he does it by bumming rides for people. And so, it's just an amazing effort by one person who is he's a professor at UC Davis. He's been studying butterflies his whole life. So in a lot of ways, I think this is probably the most rigorous set of long-term surveys because it's all done by one person. So we have a lot of information. This is just showing declines in the north. So just really quickly in terms of declines, does anyone have any questions? So I'll just go on. So obviously it's important to establish these declines, but we also need to understand the stressors. So I'm just going to talk a little bit just in general about stressors. And I think that this figure is the figure I see the most when people are talking about insect declines. It comes from Dave Wagner's paper about insect declines in 2021. And it basically is just showing all of these different factors that can put pressure on insects and other things. And he calls it death by 1,000 cuts. And it's like, pretty much everything is on here. And it's not only like all these different stressors, it's that they also interact with each other, right? So when you're trying to say, okay, what's causing the decline of insects in the US, or what's causing the decline of the regal fritillary or some bumblebee, they're on some level, you look at this and like, oh, well, I know the answer. It's everything. Everything is causing the decline, but that's not really useful. And it's often not true, right? Like different stressors are going to be more important for different insect species, and the importance of those stressors might also change over time. That's a really hard thing to grapple with. So my eye on the time. So I like to think about things long term, but I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly. Whoops, now I go backwards actually. There we go. So, I think it's just important to remember that we can't really understand declines today. Even declines, like if we're looking from 2000 to 2020, we still have to understand kind of the history of where, what's been going on in the landscape, what happened to these populations in the past. And so, I think a lot about like the spread of, the sort of history of the spread of European colonists and the increase in population density, how a lot of the land use change happened a long time ago. Like, a lot of the loss of grassland and the prairie, like that happened back at the turn of the, 20th century. And, the East Coast was almost entirely deforested, and then those forests grew back. We think about agricultural practices and, people talk about pesticides and herbicides, but we also have to take into account that these practices are constantly changing through time. So all of these things are difficult. And then we have climate, which we know is changing. But if you look at temperature, which is the thing people tend to focus on, yes, the temperature has been going up, and people always say it's up by 1.3 degrees Celsius. So it doesn't feel like that much. But even when you're looking at these maps, like you really have to look at that, right? To see how those darker shades are creeping up. But then we also have precipitation, which has a huge impact as well. And precipitation is just so much more highly variable. There's not like this slow creep, right? And even though we know precipitation is changing as well, but if you just look at these three periods in history, you know, there was a big California drought in the early 2010s. Now I guess it's the atmospheric rivers that are coming through and dumping tons of rain. But there was also a big drought back in 1885. And then like this is what it looked like at the height of the Dust Bowl, you know. So we know that there's all this huge variability that doesn't have anything to do with climate change. It's just the natural pulse of the climate. And so it's like there's this whole history, and you're looking at long-term changes, then you have to think not just about like what's causing these changes. That's what people ask me all the time. What's causing insects to decline? What is it? You know? And so I do the like death by 1,000 cuts thing. I do the, oh, it's lots of multiple things and they interact with each other because it's really hard. But it also changes through time. And that makes it really hard as well. Like that's one of the reasons it is really hard to pin these things down. And so now I'm going to shift into the monarch a little bit, which is a species I study a lot. I actually don't have anything I think in here about like the sort of migratory story of the monarch. So I'll just say briefly for people who are not familiar with the story, many people are familiar with the life cycle. Their area of greatest density is in North America. And in North America, they're largely migratory. They are other places in the world. They're not migratory. They're, for the most part, and there are two populations that are basically genetically very similar. So there's a lot of exchange, but there's an eastern population east of the Rockies and the western population. And the eastern population all overwinter in this very tiny set of sites down in Mexico. This fabulous, experience to go down there. So put it on your bucket list. If you want to like really, sort of have an enjoyable way of digging into this story and the story of how these colonies were discovered in 1976, because it was a big mystery for many decades of where these monarchs were going. Watch the movie Flight of the Butterflies. It's free on Tubi, one of the streaming services. I highly recommend it because it's not just the story and the biology of the monarch. It is the story of Fred and Nora Burkhart Val, with a huge amount of help from citizen scientists, colleagues in Mexico, these colonies. So when they were found in 1975, people started doing, very casual surveys. Every now and then different people would go out. But in 1993, it was taken over by the World Wildlife Fund. And that's where we really had the start of this good data. And you can see that, there's a lot of up and down, and there were a lot of arguments for a while, like, are monarchs really declining? I'm not really going to get into that. I would say it's pretty well established. Like, there aren't that many people who don't think that monarchs are declining. Should they be listed? Whatever. We're not going to, that's a whole other conversation. What I want to talk about is the stressors, right? So when they were first discovered, the colonies, it was in an area that undergoes a lot of deforestation. So, and they already were, if you look back to the data from the 70s, there is this indication that they're already in decline. So the thought was that that was about forest loss, right? And, but then they established a reserve. There was still a lot of logging. It was declared a UNESCO site. The logging really decreased after that. And so you could kind of say like forest loss in Mexico probably used to be really important, but maybe not anymore. Then we have, and I'm going to talk more about pesticides and herbicides. There was an adoption of a new genetically modified crop that was resistant to this very toxic herbicide, Roundup. And so that means they could start just spraying their fields with Roundup. And, monarchs, it's so interesting because in the winter, they're like the nichiest of niche butterflies, right? They are in just a few colonies that are all within like 10 miles of each other or 20 miles. They have to be in these very particular forests, like, with this very particular microclimate. So, they're just as habitat specialists as you can possibly be. But in the summer, they're generalists. And the things they like the most are row crops. They love row crops. Most of the milkweed was in the row crops. Most of their habitat was in the row crops. And so when the Roundup Ready spraying happened, there was a lot of, I don't want to say evidence, like people thought about it like incredibly hard. But the adoption of Roundup Ready crops, in my opinion, looking at all the evidence, was responsible for some of the decline. So that happened. Then, people talk about climate change all the time, but climate change isn't really having like a negative impact on most things, especially insects that are pretty resilient, until climate really started ratcheting up. And that was in the 2000s, and especially the last 10 years. Let me see where I am at the time. Please ask me questions. I might end up going all the way to the end just because of the start, but feel free to ask questions at any time if something doesn't make sense. So yeah, we have this period of rapid climate change, but also there are a lot of studies that have been done, and I've been part of these studies showing that in terms of the climate, the most important factor is rainfall and temperature in Texas. So I kind of forgot, I got sidetracked going through their cycle, but yeah, they overwinter in Mexico. They fly up in the spring to Texas and Oklahoma area. They lay eggs. Those eggs develop into the first of the year generation. Those fly up north and kind of fill in the rest of North America. And they have 2 or 3 more generations before they fly all the way back to Mexico. And, some of those are coming from Canada. So they're flying, 4,500 kilometers, like a huge way. And they make it back to the same colonies, the same trees, the same branches. It's really interesting. So, but we know that in terms of their yearly population dynamics, the most important or the most predictive factor is the climate in Texas in the spring. So that's in March and April. But then the last thing that I'll talk about is the adoption of neonicotinoids. So neonicotinoids are a pesticide that's been around a while, but the innovation that happened was implementing them as seed coatings. So they put coatings on the seed with this insecticide, and then as the plant grows, the insecticide is taken up by the plant. And the idea, is a good one, is that it's going to be really targeted, and it's just going to hit the things that eat that plant, but it turns out that it leaches into the soil, and I'll talk more about that. But you can see, like right here with the monarchs, things are changing through time. So you ask, like, what's causing the decline of the monarchs? And again, we can chart this all the way back to the 70s, is that, it just becomes this new layer onto like, oh, well, it's all these different things and they interact. And now we say, oh, it changes through time. So it is a complicated story. And at the end of the day, it's a complicated story, but we also have to figure out ways to like communicate it to people. I'm going to flip through this fast because this is just talking about how much the type of data and the availability of data has also changed through time. So from an analytical standpoint, that's really difficult because we just had different data sets in the 70s than we do now. So any questions about just the general declines of monarchs? Yes.
I have a question just because it's really, thank you. This is really, really fun for surveillance for insects. And you mentioned that the butterflies were feeding on the crops.
Well, they're not feeding on crops, they're feeding on the milkweed in between the crop rows. So milkweed, before today, where everyone wants to protect milkweed and they're gonna like make milkweed like a critical area. Like in the past, milkweed, common milkweed was identified as a noxious weed in many, many states because it would grow in between the rows and also all in the roadsides. And so it was not good for the crops. They couldn't just spray it, right? Because then they would kill the crops as well. So sorry, thank you for giving me a chance to clarify that.
The milkweed is a disturbed habitat. And so the crops themselves are creating the habitat for the milkweed, which the butterflies depend on. And I know it's really hard to go back enough in time to answer my question, which is it possible that we have, it could be controversial, inflated populations of monarchs we started with because of the.
No, absolutely. Like I mean, there was a study that I didn't like, but but that doesn't mean I love that it tried. Like I just felt like it was a little bit wrongheaded. But it went back like 10,000 years, and through genetics and like it all seemed like voodoo to me. And it did get at that question. I think it's not controversial that the creation of monoculture in the Midwest was a bonanza for monarchs. Like, I think that it's hard to know, but the idea that they are like if you want to use the term artificially inflated compared to what their, pre-colonial kind of numbers were, I think that's true. And also, I mean, I'm just starting to look through this now. I can get so easily sidetracked, but the stories, if you look back in the historical literature from the 1800s, when they're describing the monarchs, it's really like the passenger pigeons. Like they darkened the sky, they were flying over, and I mean, you definitely have stories in the Midwest of just like huge, swarms of monarchs coming through, but it doesn't sound like that. And I don't know if it's hyperbole or what, but it definitely feels like at least, in around the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, maybe there were a lot more monarchs than we'd ever observed. But it's hard to know. And also like how much deforestation was going on in Mexico at that time. So, but that's a really good question. So now I want to shift gears to this paper. I'm going to try to kind of go through it quickly because I know we're running out of time. But to me, like, and I'm not usually the most boastful person, but, I really believe in my heart that this paper, which I was just invited by agricultural economists, they were like, hey, we have this amazing data set on pesticides, and we kind of want to look and see like what kind of harm it's doing, even though in their field, their job is to look and see like we want to help the crops. So I'm just going to say, like, I feel like these two guys, Scott and David, were really brave, to not only take on this project, but to bring me and my colleague Nick Haddad onto it. We're the butterfly experts, and the work was done by a PhD student who I was also great, but now he works in fisheries. So it's not like his whole career was working in the agricultural economy department. But I also think it is the most comprehensive study in that it takes into account pretty much all the pesticides that are in use, climate or weather, and land use. And that's what's missing in a lot of studies. There are a lot of studies that show that neonicotinoids are impacting. There are a lot of studies we did looking at glyphosate, Roundup, but we were only looking at Roundup. It's like we're interested in this one particular pesticide. And so we try to separate that from everything else that's going on. So I'm actually going to skip to this because the point that they made to me when we started working together is like, they're always using these chemicals. right? You can't really just look at one chemical because first of all, if they're using that chemical, they just stopped using a different chemical. And if they stopped using the chemical, they started using a different chemical. And you don't know what the people around them, and people use all different kinds of chemicals. So they had this database of 900 chemicals, that the industry had been yearly doing these county-based estimates, and actually even more granular because they do these surveys with their farmers. And it's done by industry. So it's not, it's not like it's coming from a group that's like trying to prove that farming is bad. So what they did was they broke it up into 6 groups to try to make it tractable, even though there are hundreds and hundreds of chemicals. And in terms of weed control, you think about this in terms of technology, right? Before the Roundup Ready crops, which came out in the early 90s, there were non-glyphosate. For the most part, they use non-glyphosate weed killers. But then after this, they used almost entirely glyphosate, Roundup Ready. And, but organisms are smart, like they know how, they end up adapting to these things. And so you can even see the orange is the rise of the use of glyphosate. The dark line is county average, all the other lines are the counties. You can see glyphosate going up, other ones going down, but then there's kind of a switch in 2008. That's just because the weeds were becoming resilient to glyphosate. So there's a lot going on there.
Click OK.
What?
You can click OK on that thing that's showing up so that all of that goes away.
Oh, thank you. I do that. Oops.
There you go.
I missed. No, it's because I can't see it here, so I have to try to.
Don't worry about it.
It doesn't work.
Don't worry.
Technology is not my friend today. Okay, so insect control, we have the same thing. Like before we had like these new technologies, not that technologies haven't been changing, there have been a lot of different chemicals. I'm not an expert on this. A lot of these chemicals are really toxic, and they're expensive. So they sprayed it in response to an outbreak. And then you have these new technologies that come like BT traded seeds. So there's genetically modified to express this poison for Lepidoptera, and also these seed-coated neonicotinoids. Now, when these first came out, again, the idea is great, right? We're going to target the tissue of the crop. So it's only going to hit things that eat the crops. There was concern that the pollen was also spreading, but that kind of quickly was found to not be true. I think BT corn is like what GMOs should be. I know a lot of people are just opposed to GMOs, but this does what it's supposed to do. It targets the corn, but it's also prophylactic. It's used every year as opposed to in response to an outbreak. And neonicotinoids are the same way. Now, my understanding is it's hard, like if you're getting your seeds from Monsanto or Bayer or whatever, it's hard to get seeds that aren't coated with neonicotinoids. So those get taken up by the crops as well, but it also leaches into the soil, and it has a really long lasting effect. So that's taken up by plants in other areas. And you can see that the organophosphates, these old technology are still used, but it hasn't really changed through time. But if you look at these sort of more technologically advanced, here are the Roundup Ready crops. They really came out in the 90s, and there was this kind of slow adoption. And by the mid 2000s, and here you can really see it had kind of leveled off. But here are the neonicotinoids, and you can really see they were first came out in 2003, and the adoption was really, really fast. But you will also notice that this figure stops at 2014, right? We did this study recently. It goes from 1998 to 2014. Well, in 2015, the industry decided they were going to stop reporting on neonicotinoids. So from our perspective, where we're trying to do this really comprehensive study, we're also interested in neonicotinoids. They've been banned in Europe because of the concerns that they're hurting insects. Like, we had to stop our study here. I'm not saying there's no way to keep doing it. Like, I have all these crazy modeling ideas that I think could help us get at it, but we don't have data on neonicotinoids. We stopped the survey after 2014. And I'll just say that the 10 hottest years on record have, I don't know the exact dates, but they've been kind of in the last 10 years, right? And so we're missing that big acceleration of climate change.
So I'm sorry, you're saying that they don't have to report it anymore? Is that what happened?
This is when I always was Scott or Dave were here.
Well,
Like,
George is sitting right there.
hey, George, do you have, please jump in. My understanding.
Right.
Report their usage patterns every 3 years to our DEP,
Mhm.
Environmental Protection. And they create a report, it's on their website, and so we could follow trends, but not every state does that.
Right.
And some of them, what they rely on are the surveys that they were probably getting some of their information from, where they go to specific crops every year.
Yeah, I don't know. It's from Kinetic, if you know that.
No.
I mean, Kinetic is just the whole, the survey company that the industry. So these are industry data.
Okay.
And actually, it's really interesting. I'll have to get more information from you about that, but it's only recently that the USGS has started, sort of putting this data together in a way that is tractable for people to use for these kinds of analyses. And now, of course, they're talking about taking it all down. But a lot of the data are missing from the national surveys. And we did this just in the Midwest. And, if you remember, I was saying, like, because of Doug Tarrin, in Illinois, like, we have lots and lots of surveys, and we weren't looking at trends over time. We were really trying to take advantage of the fact that, for every year of this survey, we have these county year combinations. And so we're able to look at the county year combinations and say, what is the impact that we know this pesticide, these weather conditions were in this county in this year. So we almost like separate them up. I mean, there's still a random effect for county and year in the model. So it's not like they're considered independent, but they are considered like the source of replication. So there's a lot of replication in there. And, in the Midwest, I don't know what's available in the Midwest. Like, I have to ask people out there, but certainly from the industry, we were no longer able to get these, and the USGS doesn't have them either. So the goal, of course, is to look at environmental factors. I'm going to just skip over. I mean, obviously, we did a big, multiple regression, counting years and variant factors, offset per effort. That's how we're able to combine these. And then we're just, for each response variable, which is species richness, total abundance, and just monarch abundance, because we didn't really have the data to like separate all the species up, but monarchs are super abundant. So they're one of the easier species to do it. And obviously people care, but this is kind of at the county year level. Can we predict the species richness, the total abundance, and monarch abundance? And we're looking at pesticides, but all the different pesticides, the different weather components, and the different land cover. And I'll just say that basically land cover doesn't vary during this time. So we know it's not going to be a thing that causes the ups and downs. Weather obviously does. And we know that weather is the main thing that causes good years and bad years and butterflies. But we're also interested in pesticides. And so if we look at the effect sizes, we've really want to get rid of that thing. This doesn't matter. They separated the pesticides into the 6 groups. because you gotta see the glyphosate results somehow. I'm just like,
Yeah.
can they see that now? Oh, don't show this again. Okay. Yay. Okay, so these are the 6 groups of pesticides. Remember, there are like hundreds and hundreds within those. I just wanna, okay, yeah, I'm just gonna keep going for a little
That
while.
watch is not, it's actually 11:59. No,
Okay,
we don't look that stuff,
okay,
not our watch.
okay, I won't look at that. Okay, so what you can see is like the impact on species richness, the impact on total abundance, and the impact on monarchs based on pest control, the insecticides, land use, and weather. And first of all, when you look at results like this, it's this big, huge, multiple regression model. You have to remember, like, how do I interpret this? Basically, what this is saying is that in terms of species richness, when the amount of neonicotinoids goes up, because that orange bar is in the negative zone, that means that the number of species is going down, right? And it also says that as the amount of glyphosate goes up, the number of species is going up. So that's kind of a weird, when you hold everything constant, you have to look at that result, ignoring like everything else is constant, which doesn't really occur in nature.
No glyphosate, yes, glyphosate, time period.
No, it's actually starting when glyphosate is already leveled off. Like glyphosate comes in the early 1990s and it had kind of leveled off, I mean, it's still going up slowly, but they've been using it a lot by 1998, which is when this started. And of course, we have more data as you go. It's the same thing. We have more data as you go through time. So by the time you're in the early 2000s, it's really leveled off. There's still some difference, but, and it is saying that if you hold everything else constant, the model tells you that, as the amount of glyphosate goes up, yes, the species richness goes up. Nothing really happens to total abundance. Nothing really happens to monarchs. Species richness can be like, it's a different thing than abundance. And, but in any case, the neonicotinoids had, certainly the biggest negative effect. Like, it's really, really hard to take these things apart, right? So to me, what I would always say is that in terms of effects, neonicotinoids really sort of came to the forefront as what might be causing these declines. It's not land use, and weather is important. Like, you can look at these different factors, and we know that weather, at least for monarchs, like it's starting to get warmer and warmer, it is having an impact on them. Although those studies have gone through the 2000s, it's not necessarily clear, like, well, does this have anything to do with the decline? And so what we did, and this again was because we were working with these agricultural economists, like honestly, this, oh, there we go. This isn't a kind of analysis that is really common in my field, although now it is getting more common now that, and since I've learned about it, I've seen about it more and more. So they do this counterfactual analysis. They take all of those effect sizes from the general linear model, and basically, instead of like saying like, oh, this is the effect if we hold everything constant, what they say is like, well, we're going to play out each year using the effect sizes from the model, but then we're gonna do it in 2 ways. We're gonna run the model with each effect size from each year from all the different factors, but then we're also gonna run it in a different way where we just hold the pesticide levels in each county to the value they had in 1998, right? And so what this is showing you is, given all the, instead of like, oh, holding everything else constant, it's more like, given all the variability that's actually going on in each of these counties over time, can we see a difference if we just do sort of one counterfactual, one sort of scenario where the pesticides are the way they are versus the way they were in 1998. And what you can see here is that herbicides are kind of interesting. And this thing that happens in 2008 is kind of where that switch goes back between the glyphosate and the non-glyphosate. But overall, strangely, herbicides, like, you know, relative to the past, like the usage is actually related with an increase in species richness, a decrease in abundance, and really nothing on the monarch. So that's surprising, and I can't really make sense of that. But when you look at the insecticides, it's much clearer. What it's showing is that when you take into account all the different things that are going on and try to isolate that one factor, we see that pesticides are related to species richness, loss in total abundance, and especially a loss in monarchs. And, you know, it's a big observational study. It's a big, messy observational study. But the other thing that I'm like, this starts in 2003, you know, and again, that's just evidence, right? But it seems to coincide. And these are all the insecticides. Like, it's hard to pick out any one insecticide. But again, you really see this decline starting in 2003. And so to me, I feel like the evidence here is that, oh, let me show you one more thing. Because we know weather is important, so you can do the exact same thing with weather. Sorry, I keep trying to see here. And so, yes, weather is really important. In terms of the yearly ups and downs, you can see a much stronger effect of climate, whether you're looking at temperature, which we measure in GTD, or precipitation. You do see, like, oh, if you compare the actual climate this year to 1998, you're seeing all these ups and downs, but you're not seeing any trend during this time period. Again, it stops in 2014, like right before, you know, we have this big increase in climate.
These data are for where? Is this Michigan? Was this?
This is all of the, this is here.
That's the only thing, because
It's here, it's here, all of these counties. There's 60 counties in the Midwest.
Right, but it is a northern.
Yes, absolutely. It is a place where not only is the temperature hasn't really started spiking up, but it's also a place where temperature probably isn't near its, you know, getting as close to its stressful levels. You know, so it's not surprising. I mean, but that's, you know, it's like, I don't want to show this to people and they're like, oh, weather isn't important. Yeah, it is important. If it's like a good year, but it's not important in a trend. So I think, you know, I look at this evidence, and again, I think this is the most comprehensive insect study. And I just presented this at an insect conference in Europe, and they are so, I mean, they are the, like, there's so many people working on that, and they agreed with it too. Like, I was so afraid I was going to get pushed back because I'm talking to all the people who are doing these kinds of studies in Europe. I'm like, we looked at everything we could possibly put in there, we put in there, and neonicotinoids to me come up. So what do you do? And I guess I'll end here, which is like, I get this question all the time, and I give this talk a lot. Like, I give it to, you know, nature clubs. I'm about to give it to like the Quaker meeting that my husband goes to, and I try to like pitch it. I just went to a retirement home. You know, people are interested in this, but they also want to know, what can we do? So I always say, like, look, we know for monarchs, climate is getting important. Like, it's getting more, like, the warmer it is in the summer now, like if it's a really hot area, we're starting to see decline. So climate is important, you know. So you ask, what can you do? And at the top level, I'd say, well, climate might end up being like one of the biggest threats, but that's a global problem, right? That has to be solved globally. Pesticides, like, we could ban, I'm not a practitioner. I mean, it is not for me to say what to do. I know two things though. Two things that are true. we could ban seed-coated neonicotinoids tomorrow. And before 2003, I'm pretty sure that the US was the #1 exporter of food, in the world. We produce tons and tons of food here, so we can do it pretty darn well without seed-coated neonicotinoids. So if I were the czarina of the country, I would be like, okay, no more seed-coated neonicotinoids. And that is something there's nothing we can do about climate change tomorrow, but I'm not the czarina, to say the least. And so there's also the local. Like, I don't know that it's totally clear, and I've started getting involved in some of these projects, but is it meaningful when people plant pollinator gardens in their yard? Is that something that they can really do? There was a time that, of course, I would have been like, yes, plant pollinator gardens. But in my head, I was like skeptical. Yeah, that's not going to do anything. I've started kind of turning the corner on that, especially since it's becoming so popular. Like, people want to save pollinators. They want to save monarchs. They want to plant gardens, and I think that doing that, especially if it's not just one person in the middle of the neighborhood, but there's this social contagion, which there is. Like, I'm working with someone who, for his PhD, just showed that planting a pollinator garden in your front yard causes other people in your neighborhood to plant pollinator gardens. And now we're going to look at, hopefully, what effect is having a sign. Like, this is a North American Butterfly Association certified garden, or this is a monarch way station. Like, I do think those things matter. And I mean, obviously not for all species. Like, it's only going to be species that do well in urban or suburban environments, but a lot do. And those are going to be a lot of the most common species in this kind of new world that we've created. And so, even though I was like, it's kind of a sad talk, I do think, like, I don't end it with like, there's nothing we can do. Like, there is something we can do. There's something we can do as individuals. There's something we can do as the citizen of the county and state and country we live in, and hopefully the world. So I'll kind of end there, and thank you for your patience at the beginning, and I really appreciate like getting all that figured out, but also just having you guys here and inviting me here. So thank you. So
We are running a little bit for the seminar class, so just a few questions.
So I mean, you could do it too. So.
that's